Hello and welcome to the latest Vordel webinar in our series on new architectures for connecting your cloud, mobile and SOA applications. Today's event is going to focus on a very timely topic for the industry, namely architecting your API delivery platform for the API economy. Before we jump into today's content, I'd like to point out some housekeeping rules for everybody. On screen you should see local dial-in numbers wherever you are and the URL should you need technical support. Please be assured that this webinar will be available after the event for download from the Vordel website if you do have any difficulties during today's broadcast. And also please note that all your lines will be muted for the duration of the webinar. However, you can submit some questions via the GoToWebinar chat box, which is housed in the GoToWebinar control panel on your screens. And we will be collating all the questions you submit during the today's session for a Q&A at the end of the call. So, firstly, I'd like to introduce our two presenters today. First up will be Randy Heffner, Vice President and Principal Analyst with Forrester. Randy really needs no introduction to you all. He's a well-known and leading expert on architectures and design approaches for building enterprise applications that are secure and resilient in the face of continuous business and technology change. And Randy also blogs and tweets at these locations. Following Randy will be Vordel co-founder and CTO Mark O'Neill. And what Mark doesn't know about APIs isn't really worth knowing. And if you don't know his blogspot, So to the Cloud, I recommend you get familiar with it right after this webinar. So, quick look at the agenda without stealing the thunder from our presenters today. Randy will start proceedings with an examination of the evolution of the API economy from its early days to where it has come to today, and really why it's preoccupying the minds of folks like yourselves. He'll examine the opportunities APIs open to the organization and then look at some best practice reference models built on existing concepts and technologies to ensure your API strategy is coherent and tied into your overall business's goals. Randy will then provide you with some best Forrester recommendations on how to prepare for API use. Following that, we'll then hand over to Mark, who'll take us through some practical design and implementation advice garnered from our own experience with clients in the field, and looking at a reference architecture and do's and don't tips on what you should do and not do when it comes to delivering APIs. And finally, we'll finish up with an FAQ session at the end, as mentioned. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to our first presenter today, Randy.
Thanks, Hugh. Appreciate it. So I'm not much for like these version numbers like Web 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. Actually heard 4.0 here recently. But there really is a big shift when you shift from the website as your internet presence and whatever transactions and everything you enable there to where you have a programmable interface over the broad internet as a business presence. So this programmable web notion opens up this wide world of all sorts of different partnerships and customer engagement. We'll walk through some examples there. But the second part of the theme and the point that I want to get across today is that some people are coming at this saying, oh, great, so we want to do APIs now, let's throw them together, and all we need is kind of a portal for people to be able to access them. No, when you make this programmable internet presence your business, then it makes it critically important, and you need a strong lifecycle enabled delivery platform, and we'll get more into what I mean by that, but also how that derives from the world of SOA. But let's take a step back and understand something about what we mean, how this started, what this shift is. And people have been, companies have been integrating over the network, whether private networks, public dial-up networks, or the broad internet for decades. But Amazon.com really was that big kickoff, a number of years back, maybe now 8 or more years back. It was a kickstart for the API economy when they had their website, go buy Amazon, anything A to Z, etc. And they had their website up and going, and you can do whatever you want to and go in to buy things and buy via mobile interfaces that they've had via feature phone for a long time. But Amazon got the bright idea to say, let's actually just put some APIs directly to the business logic in the server here. And those APIs, which are available via SOAP and REST, We can let anybody, any mom and pop shop be integrated to Amazon. Even folks like me. This is a hobby little website that I have where I do film analysis and such, and I use one of the simplest types of interfaces with just an API key that references and links into the Amazon platform as it hands off to an Amazon page. But the point, and there's all sorts of additional deeper ways that I could go with that type of integration. But the point, from a business perspective, the big switch that's going on with this type of thing is that via its store APIs, Amazon doesn't choose its partners choose Amazon, which is a small little bit of vetting that Amazon does when you register for it before they issue the API key. But now Amazon has a presence on, I don't even know what the number is now, but I'd be surprised if there's any less than 100,000 or more other websites across the internet. Maybe I wouldn't even be surprised if somebody said it was 1 million. But the point is that they're open for business via direct APIs, and people can present the interface to Amazon in many different ways, however they might want, that fits into their business. But let's talk a little more about what an API is. What we're talking about here, to drill down on what I've said, is it's a direct programmable interface at the organization's edge, open to the broad internet, of course, to appropriately authorized users, however the business strategy for a particular API demands. And the API user, in accessing the functions that are available, whatever the parameters and the scope of the service is, can do business most any way they want to. They just take the capabilities that you provide for them, and they can put them together in new and creative ways. They use the old mashup term to smash them into with other functionality and other businesses to make a package deal or whatever it might be. The historical view of API, and I put API in quotes here because I think as we talk about API management, it's an unfortunate sort of term. But the historical view of that term, API, that's been around for a long time. It was a bit of code that was bound to a programming language, had a stateful implementation, typically was directly linked to a bit of program code as you were doing a system build. It's application centric and chatty. I may ask to set a parameters on the API, set another parameter, okay, now make the transaction go. May have a very chatty interface. That's historically, but when we're talking APIs at the edge here, then the dominant thing should be it's bound to a network messaging format and protocol, typically REST, more on that in a moment. It will have a stateless implementation, which is in line with good service-oriented type of design, and it's typically activity-centric. We're trying to get a particular thing done. Buy a book, check status of a package that's been tracked, and it's coarse-grained, so it will not be chatty. But we've described back to the first bit of this. It's a programmable access to our organization's transactions or data. Well, we don't really want people to be bound to our applications. What we want them to do is be bound to and use our business. So the design view that you take of the APIs is very different, and this is a bit of the application-centric versus service-oriented, activity-centric distinction that I'm getting to. But it should be a business building block. Make reservation, convert account, business things, business building blocks that people should be doing via these APIs. There may be lower level APIs that get to bits of data and the like, but still you should be able to view and understand those in a business context for the greatest amount of flexibility. Now I'm going to say that's a best practice, a general rule. There will be other situations where maybe it is appropriate to have a more chatty API or a more application-centric kind of API at the edge. But I want to push you toward thinking in terms of business building blocks. Well, the possibilities are endless for what you might do with this. I'll give you 5 examples. Customer service. Allow customers to get to their data. Simple example of this is package tracking, which you can do via an API on a shipper's website. Sure, do it via a web page, but if I'm a online retailer, maybe I don't want to have to ship you off to their web page. I want to be able to check status for you and proactively notify you or something. So I can get an API for that, or customers can build that directly. White labeling your business. You can build volume by letting others sell your business, and their customers think it's them, not you. An example of this is Thomson Prometric, which provides testing services and certification testing, and some organizations that they work with, you go schedule a test, you go into the test center, and up until that last bit, you're thinking you're working with the customer of Thomson Prometric, who has their own certification test to give, but it's actually Thomson Prometric at their facilities and their systems that are administering the test. Process optimization. Many logistics firms allow you to create an end-to-end process flow because of the APIs that they provide and that you can access across the logistics life cycle, including supply chain management and customs clearance and inventory management and warehouse management and shipping, the core of what we think of when we think of logistics. Increasing market mind share. So there are folks like me who may want to create an aggregation kind of website or function on their website. I actually do a little of this myself, where I bring in information from other sources and present it so that people have an integrated look at multiple things, multiple sources, and that those other sites get additional web presence. And then finally, another example, channel enablement. Let your partners embed your stuff in their offerings. And in the mobile world, the mobile telcos do a lot of that and keep trying to push forward on their architectures for making that easier and easier. So, great. Well, we'll touch a little bit on this connection between API and SOA, and that APIs typically are service-oriented in their approach and their design. I want to push that further and say that it's not just that they are similar, it's that APIs are just simply part of a strong SOA strategy, and they're where that SOA strategy touches the edge of your enterprise, and to put a particular spin on the view, the life cycle, how those APIs are used, and the business model that you intend to achieve via what you have at the edge. But let's look a little bit of this. If you have a SOA strategy, you've got any number of source applications, mainframe and distributed systems and packaged apps. And here I'm going to include cloud-based apps as well, SaaS and infrastructure as a service and platform as a service apps that you may have built on those. Those are all part of your base infrastructure. And if you have an SOA strategy, you're building a strong SOA service layer that via a number of different protocols brings the capabilities of these different applications together in a unified way. And there are different types of SOA services. I'm not going to go into them in detail, but these 3 that I've listed, business, application, and infrastructure services, are 3 broad categories of services. You can see that taxonomy in many places in the industry. But it's business services that become particularly interesting at the edge for letting people connect to your business. When you have these services, then, and you're build a coherent portfolio of services, and there's a whole other conversation about SOA governance that brings in life cycle conversations about how you manage the process of envisioning what these services should be, and deciding when it's the right time to build one, building it and making sure that it's built right to fit into a coherent portfolio of SOA services versus just being a haphazard library of services. So that's all good. But these services, as you create them, you think in terms of them being offered internally, and then potentially some of them being offered at the edge of the enterprise, so maybe internally and at the edge. And when they're offered internally, the three most common protocols are SOAP, Java Message Service, and REST in that order. And I use the term protocol loosely here. But you might have any application that you're producing and providing to your enterprise, portal, web, mobile, whatever it might be, that that application accesses your portfolio of services through these protocols. When you start talking about APIs and services offered at the edge, then here's where the dominant protocol in the market today is REST. I wouldn't say the sole protocol, though, because there's still reasons to use SOAP, and that's a whole other conversation, by the way. But SOAP and REST differ in their characteristics of how you program to them and how you understand what a particular service is doing, and in the degree of standardization built into and around the protocols. There basically are no standards for REST. It may be provocative to say it that way. REST uses standards, but the particular way that any given REST API is constructed is proprietary use of those standards. In any case, both of them may be there. REST is dominant, particularly if it's just straight API access to a broad open world like Amazon does, and for mobile apps and the like. One final comment, since I started with Amazon and that example. Particularly in the early days of the SOAP versus REST conversation, one of the data points that was used to say, see how good REST is, was the fact that most access into Amazon store was via their REST API, not SOAP. I don't think that's a good argument for why REST is there, because Amazon's goal is to have it open to the broad world of mom and pop shops and everything else whose business requirements are and requirements for reliability, transactionality, security, et cetera, are lower versus some of the things that you might achieve in a more standard way with SOAP. Enough of that, just to say that over the broad internet, the broader your audience, the more that REST is applicable. And typically when you're doing an API-based access at the edge, broad access is exactly what you want. But here's more on why these are part of the same strategy. When you look into some of the details, that the architecture and infrastructure and the way you manage APIs is really the same as SOA, only a little different in little ways. Security, you have a broader audience, you have less control over that audience, and because of the trends in the broad, open, internet environment, mom and pop shop, every little web developer kind of market, new security models come into play, like OAuth. New models come in because it's easier to manage something like API keys, like are used for Amazon's store interface. So you have these additional capabilities, but the core security infrastructure is very similar. SOA management, again, the same, except you're more likely to put usage limits on the APIs the way that Salesforce does for accessing some of its APIs. And per-use billing is more likely. Many APIs, of course, are open, just broad open access, maybe with some usage limits. But you have the possibility to bill on a per-use basis or bill on a package basis of some kind. Service discovery and reuse is very much the same, except when you're dealing with a broad audience, you don't have governance control over that broad internet audience the way you might for your own developers. So you have to deal with the issue that if they can't figure out how to use the API and what it's about, they're more likely to go elsewhere, just drop it and forget about using your API. So you've got to address more of the issue of helping them understand, and that'll come into the platform picture that we'll look at next. Service mediation, the same. And this is even more the same. It's just a difference that REST is more common than SOAP. But anything that you might do on the edge, except for maybe a little bit with the security models, you might do also internally. And even some of the security models you might do internally. So the mediation requirements are the same. So the type of gateway and edge kind of SOA platform functionality would be the same. And then the life cycle. Again, same as SOA in that if you're just slinging code and throwing APIs out there in an unmanaged sort of way, then you've taken some big risks. So you can take big risks. So people make choices to take business risks. But the deeper and farther you get on, the more spaghetti code you'll be building, the more instability you'll be building if you don't have good lifecycle management control. And the difference here is you want some broader developer collaboration in understanding what those APIs should be. Again, this ties back to the service discovery and reuse that will come up in the platform slide. So every one of these, the API management requirements just simply add a little bit on to the core SOA requirements. If I was to put a number to it, just anecdotally, I would say that if you had everything you needed for good, strong SOA management and SOA service lifecycle and the rest, you'd have 90 to 95% of what you need for API. No, I got to cut that back because of the developer portal requirement. You'll see here, I'd say you maybe have 80 to 85% of what you'd need for the API management platform that we'll walk through here now. So what we're asking on this slide is what needs to be in the big green box for our API management platform. And what we're assuming is that we got a whole world of developers out there, and we've got an API-based application that or actually any number of them, that need to get into and use our services. What needs to be in the middle between that API-based app and the actual services that we're running in our environment? We'll walk through this in a life cycle sort of way. So developers hear that you've got some APIs and they get keen to use them. We need some developer onboarding functionality. This will be different because internally in your SOA lifecycle management, you have a different sort of regular cycle that you go through. But for developers coming in, they don't know a thing about you. They don't know it, and you have a market-oriented sort of interface that you're providing to them to get them excited about using APIs, as well as knowing what they need to do in order to start using them. But as they get registered, they'll be creating credentials that you need to store and hold for use as the APIs are used. Then they got their credentials, they're ready to rock and roll. Well, now they got to understand how to actually use the APIs. And this is where developer documentation and a support forum for developers comes in. Many different ways you might manage that, but you need that as part of the functionality. So they learn how to use the APIs. They start coding and getting going. And the next thing is to secure and protect and do the mapping and mediation that needs to be done from the API request coming in to whichever service is running in your environment that you're exposing via the APIs. So you have an API gateway that sits at the edge in the DMZ typically, grabs the request and figures out what to do with it, looks at credentials, makes sure that it's authorized and the rest. So they get going and running and using these APIs. Everything's great. But sometimes not everything's great. Things go bump in the night, so you want some runtime management to make sure that you see what goes wrong before they see what goes wrong. and that API management may feed developer reporting and billing of various kinds, depending upon what the nature of the APIs and the business model for the APIs is. So great. This is all that one might say this is all you really need, but I keep emphasizing that no, you better be realizing that you need this lifecycle management piece in the middle, and the API registry repository that will be built to house and let people access and keep track of versions and the rest of the services. Lifecycle management is a much bigger topic, webinar for another day maybe. But in relation to your SOA infrastructure, you could substitute SOA for each one of these API terms and fundamentally use the exact same SOA infrastructure that you have. And really the credential storage as well. It's the developer stuff on the left that has the most unique sort of set of requirements. So that's at 10 to 15% that you, 15 to 20% that you need to have for developers. So what do you do? How do you get started with this? Well, I emphasize the importance of a business perspective on this. And the first thing is to look at your customers and partners and see, well, where would anything actually be needed? So you might ask, think through life from a customer or a partner's perspective and say, where would someone say, it'd be a better thing if I could do something, whatever it might be, without calling, emailing, texting, or going to a web page. So, an online retail site as a customer of yours, as a shipping vendor, they might say, look, it'd be better if my customers didn't have to go to this other website, but I could just provide them the information about the status of their package. Great. API interface for shipping status. Then look at it the other way. Ask, what are your capabilities in the digital world? What information, transactions, and the rest might you offer? And who or what might they add value to? And maybe you find new customers and new partners. So in some sense, this is what Thomson Financial found when they realized they had some data internally that they could sell externally. But the idea here is to find a valuable digital connection, that is worth enabling as an API. Then look at your employees and your business strategy. Where can we make something easier for employees or further business strategy via an API sort of thing? So go find a way to start providing APIs for internal customers. That may be a way to get started. Maybe as part of your bring your own device program, you allow certain APIs so that your employees can get some information on their own and feed it into whatever app they may have on their device. If you're already doing SOA, but you're not doing it with REST, then you need to learn the ins and outs of REST. And there's a fair bit to learn there and a number of different directions to go. The key thing to understand starting out is what I said earlier, is there are not standards for REST. There are a bunch of possibilities for how you might construct a REST interface. So you need to focus very much on how will you standardize your interfaces for REST and what models will you use and go after. If you're already doing SOA with REST, or once you get up to speed if you weren't doing it already, examine your security in your security ecosystem. What I mean by this is within the body of customers that you and folks that may use the APIs and the expectations that they may have, who are major identity providers? Could you let people log in with their Facebook ID, for example, and use Facebook as an identity provider within the ecosystem that you're looking to serve? Then set tight API guidelines and standards on your external APIs. Because there aren't standards to say, we're just doing that, you have to be more careful in specifying things so that they be consistent, manageable, understandable, coherent, And if people are used to using one of your APIs, they can apply that learning to the next API that they use. Plan a life cycle for engaging developers and work that into an API life cycle as well. And don't forget that this is part of your SOA strategy. So build coherence into your SOA strategy, your broader SOA strategy. Look for infrastructure synergies with your SOA platform. Look for lifecycle synergies, because a SOA service you create internally, you may decide later to make part of your API portfolio as well. So it's a whole different business when you start opening up your business via API management, and you need to think carefully through the platform and the life cycle and the processes for it. Hugh?
Okay, thanks very much, Randy. That's very fruitful and very valuable information. I think you'll all agree, and a good mix there, I think, of both the conceptual and the architectural mixed with some real practical tips as well. So now, as Nina Simone used to say, this is the audience participation part. Before we hand you over to Mark O'Neill, we'd like to post a polling question. So I'd invite you all to, hopefully you're all seeing on the screen there a question with some radio buttons for your answers. And we'd like to invite you all to select and post the vote, and we'll present the results then at the end. So who is responsible in your organization for overseeing the company's API strategy? Is it managed by individual developers? Or maybe there's a more strategic approach to it, a holistic top-down approach, be it an IT manager or an enterprise architect, or indeed does your CIO have visibility of it? Or maybe you just don't have a clue. So please post your votes now, and we'll see what the results are in a second. And here are the results, and wow, this is great to see. A lot of you have got a good grip on where things are at, and you're actually implementing or developing a strategy at a fairly senior level within the IT infrastructure or the IT department. That's a good sign. Interestingly enough, almost a quarter of you haven't a clue who's in charge. So maybe that's one thing you'll take away from today's presentation is go find out who does have a clue, and come back to us then if you need any answers. Thanks, Randy. Now we're going to make Mark a presenter, and Mark will take us through with some slides to show us some real-world practical do's and don'ts from the field. Mark.
Thank you, Hugh, and thank you, Randy. So as Hugh mentioned, I'm going to be talking about where the rubber meets the road. I'm going to talk about practical do's and don'ts for implementing your API management strategy. I'll be talking about API delivery and giving some actionable items that you can take away from this webinar to implement in your own organization. First of all, as Randy mentioned, REST is the predominant way of interacting with APIs. It's important if you're coming from a SOA background to ensure that REST is a first-class citizen. Generally, it's not in the historically SOAP, WSDL, UDDI, and XML are the first-class citizens, and perhaps your management and your tooling around your SOA infrastructure presupposes that everything is SOAP. You have to bubble up REST and assume that it's going to be about URLs going forward, not about SOAP, although SOAP still must be accommodated because, as Randy also mentioned, there are quite a lot of scenarios where SOAP does make sense. And indeed, in frameworks such as Microsoft.NET, SOAP is very, very widely used still. For developer APIs, for your portals where you're getting your developers excited about using your APIs, it's important to emphasize REST. Show examples of using REST. Assume that most of the API usage will be REST, which has been a trend for a long time now, as Randy also mentioned, since the famous data point with Amazon, where given the choice of REST and SOAP, developers will use REST. Part of the reason is because REST enables broad access to APIs and doesn't present the same type of barriers. The analogy is often with a checkout at a shopping mall. You don't want to put hurdles in front of it. You want to make it easy for people to buy things. Similarly, REST makes it easy for developers to develop the apps that use your APIs. Within REST, it's predominantly JSON with HTTP gets that are being used. That's the pattern within REST itself. Rather than XML, it's JSON, which is predominantly being used. Part of that is because of the influence of mobile apps. That's the do, but then there's also the corresponding don't. The back end still exists, so your infrastructure in the enterprise still exists. Some of that will be SOAP-based, but it will also be existing systems. People also often mention legacy systems. What legacy often means is systems that are used right now in the enterprise. It's important when you're deploying APIs to have it as a way to deploy your business services. So that means it's linking to your business services, all of these connectors, message queues, databases, ESBs, B2B type interfaces like FTP, SFTP, and then the protocols that go with that, things like AS2, EBXML, those all still exist. So even though a developer may be writing an app that's very simple and uses REST APIs, in the back end you're going to be connecting to things that most likely do not use REST. This is where the API delivery platform comes into play. It's where the API gateway sits at the edge of the network and manages the connection from an API portal, which is self-service for developers, to get everything they need to develop the apps, to the actual API requests coming in from these apps, and then to map that to the internal systems. The API gateway becomes the API delivery platform, which is delivering your internal apps out to the API consumers. The next do tip is to simplify the developer sign-up. It's a different paradigm with APIs versus internal development. In the past, if you're developing applications in your enterprise SOA, you already know who your developers are. Most likely they're employees. You don't have to sign them up. You don't have to get them excited about developing because it's their job to do it. In the case of APIs, you do have to make it very simple for example, an iPhone developer to simply go to a page and register just like here, get an API key, and then use the API. You don't want to make it have too many hurdles for them to do this, or they will simply go elsewhere. But on the other hand, you don't want to create a whole new interface to a brand new user store sitting out somewhere in the cloud. You don't want to have passwords, all these different keys stored out in the cloud if you already have local repositories that store this type of information. So it's important to connect to the likes of LDAP, Active Directory, all these different stores, Oracle Identity Management, RSA. These things still exist. This is where organizations are already storing this kind of information, and you are well advised to connect your API delivery platform into these stores rather than creating a brand new store that you then have to worry about that's sitting somewhere out in the cloud. The API gateway, again, links this. It links the API delivery, the apps that are using the APIs, these credentials, the API keys, also OAuth, or even simple HTTP auth into your existing enterprise identity management infrastructure. You're not creating all these new passwords out in the cloud. The third do recommendation is about REST-friendly security. As I mentioned, REST is predominantly used for APIs rather than SOAP. SOAP does have actually quite a mature security model, which is often criticized, things like WS security, all the famous WS specs, which are very cumbersome but are actual standards. With REST, there is, with API keys, not so much a standard, as Randy has alluded to. It isn't a standard, but what it is more of a convention or industry standards, if you like. So Amazon has an industry standard on how it does API keys. There isn't a standard you can point to, an open standard out there for API keys. There is, though, for OAuth. So OAuth is used for essentially single sign-on scenarios where you can use consumer identity to log into APIs. It's very important for mobile apps. Essentially, it means that users don't have to log in again. Also, if users are using your API through an app, then they can authorize the app to access the API on your behalf. So it's important because the user is typically one step away from the API. They're not manually invoking a REST request. What they're doing is using an app that does that, and OAuth joins the dots between you, that app, and the API. Also remember, application firewalling is still important. REST APIs are predominantly examples of web resources, so the same type of web security applies to them. It's important not to introduce security holes as you do this. API key security, because there's no standard for it, it is tempting to simply roll your own. That often means just simply sending the API key with the message. Sometimes that's even over HTTP. This is very insecure, and it means that you can have the traffic snipped and people can pull the API key and access on someone else's behalf. So although it's tempting to roll your own API key security, it's not a good idea. Neither is storing all the keys in the cloud, storing it in a non-secure manner. There have been plenty of examples of data breaches already. It's important to link that in with your systems. So you must ensure that your API delivery platform provides this security best practice, so you're not trying to roll your own security. Vordel provides resources around REST API security, provides guidelines that you can apply in your own organization, and you can read these resources about how to apply to your REST APIs. Another key requirement for APIs is quotas. So very much people want to apply the so-called freemium model, where access to the API is free up to a point, and then after that you pay. So it's free, then there's a premium. Also, you want to make sure that your system usage is managed. You might have different levels of access for different people. And finally, to ensure that your API doesn't become a backdoor for data harvesting, for people to simply write apps that maliciously pull down all of your data. Quotas are very important for API management, and they're frequently one of the top requirements that people see in an API delivery platform. But it's important not to have an effect on your API as a result. So by applying quotas, by applying all of this tooling, all of this management to your APIs, you can't have the side effect that the API delivery becomes slow. This is the case where if you are applying lots of different rules, the rules themselves should be implemented very fast. And then you're not impacting on the API usage by clients, because many APIs are used by user-facing or user-facing applications, for example, on a phone. The user will notice any latency. The last thing you want to do is add any undue latency to it. So you need a high-performance API delivery platform. In the area of SOA, there has been the gateway product category in which Vordel sits. Gateways are built for speed. Similarly, gateways apply to API management as API gateways, and the same technology applies, the same speed, making sure that applying management to your APIs doesn't have any side effects in terms of slowing them down. It's important also to link your portal to the enterprise. So although the portal is what you see, and it's natural to really focus just on the portal, because that's where you have your forums, that's where developers become excited about your APIs, that's where you learn about the APIs. It's just one part of it. The portal is the public-facing part of your APIs, but the actual delivery of the applications behind them needs to dive in behind the firewall and connect to your internal systems. It's natural to focus on the portal and perhaps not so much on the links to the internal systems, which are not as exciting, not as new as APIs, but it is important to have the link there. By decoupling this link, you also enable scenarios like having different portals. You could have an external-facing portal for third-party developers. You could have an internal portal. These different portals may all connect in through the same API gateway. So you're decoupling there. And it's also a separation of ownership, because you might have internal IT managing the API gateway, but different teams, different project teams managing different portals. So you can have this type of separation of ownership. So it's important not to be fixated just on the portal, because the portal is the piece that you can see. So you link the two together. You may have a portal that is commercial, using a SaaS provider for the portal. You may build your own portal. In that case, you can connect in either way, the commercial portal, your own homegrown portal, to the API gateway. What the portal provides is everything you need to know, everything you need to use to access the API. And then the API gateway connects this back into your in-house apps. So in summary, I've gone through a number of do's and don'ts about how practically to apply your API management strategy using an API delivery platform. I've talked about security, linking to your on-premise infrastructure, making it very simple for developers to get up and running with your APIs, and not to forget about performance. Finally, I'd like to mention that if you want to get hands-on with Vordel's API management, we're providing an upcoming workshop tour around the world, and you can look at the URL here, vordel.com/immerse, to look at when we'll be coming to a city near you. And with that, I'd like to hand back to Hugh.
Okay, Mark, thanks very much for that. And folks, we're just if you've got any questions, I would ask you to submit them, please, via the question box or the chat box, whichever you wish. In the meantime, we'd like to post one final poll, which you should now see on your screens. And again, we'd invite you all to put your finger where your mouth is and vote. And we'll present the results shortly. Okay, there's a clear runner out in front and two close in second place, neck and neck. Okay, we'll publish these results. We close the poll now and we'll publish them. Thanks. And you should see the results now on your screens there. So, you know, following the train of the presentation, really, a lot of a large percentage of you are using APIs to build out new channels. I think Randy's slide at the beginning there really speaks to this polling question. And again, mobile, not surprisingly, is in second there. So there's quite a few of you on others, so it'll be interesting to find out what the others are. But thanks for that, everybody. Now we are going to open the floor to some questions, and throughout the session we've had one or two people submit questions. The first one I'll put to Randy. And maybe Mark, you can follow up. So what are the performance implications of exposing internal applications to APIs? Are these apps now going to be overrun by new users? And what is essentially what impact is that going to have on performance? So Randy, perhaps you could talk about that one first.
Yeah, here's where the connection to the broader SOA strategy becomes very interesting. It's a great question to do, because if you have a strong overall SOA strategy, then you've got monitoring and management, as well as life cycle and capacity planning for your services and the rest, so that you are understanding and managing the use of those services. Now, clearly, when you've got the broad open internet to the access to the world, then there's a risk that there would be a sudden influx of demand. That over here in the States we talk about the effect of a Super Bowl ad. And all of a sudden everybody goes, a million people go to use the service. And in that case, you would have the API gateway, and along with the defined usage limits and usage rates associated with the service, and that would be your protection. And so you need to think through what the possibilities of that sudden rush on your service is, and what the potential drivers might be, and make sure that you are architected for that. But the point is, to the core question, it wouldn't overrun the internal application because you'd have those protections in place. But you got to plan for if you might have that overrun, because you don't want to turn 1 million people away if you don't have to.
Great, thanks, Randy. And Mark, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just to echo a point that I made earlier, in that when you do open the ability for third parties to access your internal systems via APIs, to ensure that, for example, you have quota limits set up, that you've thought about it in advance, that this is how much traffic that the internal systems can take, and that you're managing that proactively. Quotas are typically used for that, thresholds, and to apply really management. So as part of API management, to apply those types of rules. And secondly as well, as part of the API delivery platform, to make sure it has the horsepower needed as well. If it's, for example, taking in REST API calls, converting them, let's say, to SOAP, converting them into requests that are going to an internal system, that's going to then be doing some heavy lifting in terms of all of the conversions it's going to be doing there to deliver your APIs. In that case as well, you want a high-performance API gateway that's going to be able to take that type of load.
And there's a little detail wrapped inside there as well in terms of the quotas. It's not in the functionality of the gateway. There are some that would only do traffic limiting, which is, if you have a 10 per second limit and you hit your 10, then the 11th and 12th ones get dropped. There are those that have traffic shaping, where it would hold the 10th and the 11th and submit them in the next second. So that's another kind of more real detailed feature in there to look at.
Exactly, and that's often an overlooked feature, because I think people assume that if you apply a quota that says, for example, you have 10 requests per second, that means number 11 is going to be blocked. But sometimes we want to do something more sophisticated with those extra messages. You might want to route them to a different back-end system. You might want to send a notification that effectively puts the client into an overage type scenario, like a cell phone overage plan, so they are billed more. Or you might want to queue them up and do, as Randy said, traffic shaping with them. Those are all the sophisticated features that go beyond just simply applying a cutoff to the quota limits.
Great stuff, guys. Interestingly, just on the polling question, one of the attendees made a good point that one of the key driving influences for their organization is to convert existing business channels to effectively an easier to manage platform, with also combined with opening new business channel opportunities. I guess we've got time for one more question. It pertains to the security aspects of things. And this probably to you, Mark, initially, saying the question is, you've listed several options for security, but what in particular would you recommend as the security options for APIs? In other words, I guess the person wants to know what specific recommendations would you have?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's certainly a question we get very often, because whenever there's a menu of different security items out there that you can choose, it's natural to say, okay, well, here's the different options: API keys, OAuth, regular HTTP auth, SSL. What should I use? So in the case of APIs, we've seen that there is certainly convention around API keys, but it's important not to just simply have a security framework where the key is just simply sent with the message, because that could be sent, for example, over HTTP, very easily sniffed, very easy for someone to impersonate the client. For example, with Amazon, it's more sophisticated than that, where the message includes a digest, it can't be changed, and you provide a secret key as well that's used to create this digest. Amazon also provides sample different scripts that can be used to create this on the client side. That's something that we recommend because it's quite easy to implement. It's also secure, and it's also quite widely understood. OAuth, similarly, especially OAuth 2.0, which is also now widely implemented, allows you to use consumer identity, Facebook, Google, and so forth, for authentication to your apps, that's also an important framework as well that we recommend. And we also recommend as well that SSL is used across the board. So when you're sending any type of information, SSL has not gone away. It's still important to use it across the board as well to underpin what you've done with the API keys or with OAuth.
Yeah, and I would just add the business perspective on that, just to emphasize what I said earlier about knowing your community or communities, because your communities may have different needs, different identity providers that they might be interested in, and those identity providers might have different standards that they prefer and the like. And the content, the kind of thing you're doing via those APIs may push some folks to want higher auditability and the like. But for the most part, the APIs are a broader, less. We're not doing like APIs for international foreign exchange transactions. There's a different kind of process for business connections for that sort of thing. But nonetheless, understand your business, understand your community, because it not only has to be accepted by them technically, you want it to be facilitated and natural for them to adopt just from what they're used to.
Very good comments there, guys. I'd like to thank you, in particular, Randy, for attending today, and Mark for putting on a good show as usual. Folks, we'd like to thank you all for attending and for being very attentive. You've all hung in there. It's just before the hour now, so just a reminder, we will be posting the webinar to the Vordel website, and we will send you an email with location within the next 24 hours. And finally, I'd like to draw your attention once more to the upcoming workshop tour. You can go to the Vordel website and register your interest. There's a number of cities already posted where we'll be appearing. And if we're not in a city near you, do let us know, and we'll make sure to get in touch. So once again, Randy, Mark, thank you very much, and goodbye to everybody.
Thanks, you.
Thanks, you.